"Poor thing," my mother-in-law said from the other side of the funeral home door. "She probably thinks wearing a black dress means dignity, but she cannot even afford this funeral." I stopped with my hand on the brass handle, so close to walking into the family preparation room that I could smell the coffee, the lilies, and the sharp lemon cleaner they used on the polished floors. For a second, I thought grief had twisted her words in my head. Maybe I had heard wrong. Maybe Patricia Carter, the woman who had smiled at me every Christmas while handing me a gift card like a charity receipt, had not really said that about me at my own husband's funeral. Then Mark, Jonathan's older brother, gave a low laugh and said, "Emily always knew how to look helpless. That was her talent." My fingers tightened around the small black purse I had carried since sunrise. Inside it, folded behind a packet of tissues and Jonathan's wedding ring, was the paid invoice from Collins and Sons Funeral Home. Every flower arrangement, every printed memorial program, every chair in the chapel, every mile of transportation for relatives flying in from out of state, every tray of food waiting for the reception room, even the oak casket Jonathan had chosen years ago during one of those impossible conversations married people think they will never truly need, all of it had been paid for by me 3 days earlier. Not by Patricia. Not by Mark. Not by Susan. Me. Emily Carter, the broke widow they were whispering about like I was standing on the sidewalk with an empty cup in my hand. I had not told them because Jonathan had asked me, in the quiet way he always asked for the hardest things, not to turn his goodbye into a courtroom. "Let people show you who they are," he had told me once, lying in our living room under the blue quilt from Maine, his voice tired but steady. "And when they do, believe them the first time." I believed them now. I believed every word through that door. Susan, his sister, sighed like she was bored with my existence. After today, she will have to face reality. Jonathan is gone. The house will not keep itself warm just because she cries in it. Patricia clicked her tongue. She should be grateful we let her stand with the family at all. Let me. The words landed harder than they should have. I had spent 18 years beside Jonathan Carter. I knew the exact way he took his coffee, 2 creams and no sugar. I knew he hated carnations but loved white roses because they reminded him of his grandmother's porch in Vermont. I knew which hymns made him emotional and which stories he wanted told when he could no longer tell them himself. I knew the man they were about to perform grief for. And they thought they were letting me stand near him. I looked down at my purse, at the corner of the invoice peeking out like a secret with teeth. For one heartbeat, I wanted to open the door, place that paper on the table, and watch every smug face collapse. Instead, I breathed in slowly, tucked the invoice deeper into my purse, smoothed the front of my simple black dress, and stepped back from the door. Not because I was weak. Not because I was afraid. Because if they wanted to bury the truth beside my husband, I was going to let them carry the shovel a little longer. 3 days earlier, before the lilies arrived and before the Carter family began acting like they owned every corner of grief, I sat alone in Jonathan's hospital room with the blinds half open and the late afternoon sun spilling across his blanket. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of machines and the distant sound of nurses moving through the hallway. Jonathan had always hated silence when it felt heavy, so I kept talking even when his eyes were closed. I told him the dogwood tree in our front yard had started blooming. I told him I had finally fixed the loose cabinet handle in the kitchen because he had been reminding me about it for 6 months. I told him the Red Sox had lost again, and even then, with almost no strength left, he gave the smallest smile. That was Jonathan. Even at the edge of goodbye, he still found a way to make me feel less alone. Near sunset, he opened his eyes and asked me to reach into the drawer beside his bed. Inside was a cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front in his careful handwriting. Emily. Just that. No last name, no explanation, because he never needed extra words with me. My hand shook when I picked it up. He looked at me and whispered, "Do not open it until you need to remember who you are." I tried to tell him not to talk like that, but he gently squeezed my fingers, and I stopped. We both knew what was coming. We had known for weeks, even while everyone else in his family pretended denial was the same thing as hope. Patricia visited when people from church were watching. Mark came twice, both times on his lunch break, both times talking more about parking than about his brother. Susan sent flower emojis in text messages and called it support. But I was there for the midnight fevers, the insurance forms, the quiet prayers, the soup he could barely swallow, and the mornings when he looked at me with apology in his eyes because he hated needing help. I never once let him apologize for being loved. After he passed, I drove home through streets that looked offensively normal. People were picking up groceries, pumping gas, walking dogs, arguing at stoplights, living inside a world that had not paused for the man who had been my whole life. On the kitchen table, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, a small folded note about his funeral wishes, and one sentence underlined twice, "Do not let them make you smaller at my funeral." I pressed that paper to my chest and cried until the clock on the microwave changed from 1 hour to the next. Then I made the call. Collins & Sons Funeral Home was exactly the kind of place Jonathan would have chosen, dignified but not flashy, with brick walls, white columns, and a chapel that seated 150 people. Mr. Collins spoke softly, never rushing me, never treating my grief like paperwork. I chose the white roses, not carnations. I chose the oak casket Jonathan had once pointed to in a brochure and called simple enough to keep my mother from turning me into a parade. I chose the hymns he loved, the memorial cards with his favorite photo from Vermont, and a reception with coffee, roast chicken, green beans, rolls, and apple pie because Jonathan believed nobody should drive home from a funeral hungry. When Mr. Collins told me the total, I did not flinch. I gave him my card, signed every page, and paid in full. Not because I wanted credit. Because Jonathan deserved peace, and I was still his wife. Then, as I placed the receipt in my purse, Mr. Collins asked, "Would you like the family informed that you are the one arranging everything, Mrs. Carter?" I looked at Jonathan's letter resting beside my hand and thought of Patricia's careful smiles, Mark's proud little speeches, Susan's pity disguised as concern. I shook my head. "Not yet," I said. "Let them show me who they are first." By the next morning, Patricia had already decided that grief needed a chair at the head of the table, and she intended to sit in it. She called me at 7:15 while I was standing in Jonathan's closet, holding one of his navy sweaters against my chest because it still smelled faintly like cedar and the soap he used after mowing the lawn. I let the phone ring 3 times before answering. Her voice came through sharp and polished, the same voice she used with church ladies and bank tellers when she wanted something done her way. "Emily, we need to meet at the funeral home today. There are arrangements to correct." Correct. Not discuss. Not review. Correct. I looked at the letter on my nightstand, Jonathan's handwriting waiting for me like a hand on my shoulder, and said, "I will be there at 10. When I arrived at Collins & Sons, Patricia was already in the lobby wearing a black wool coat, pearl earrings, and an expression that made sorrow look like a social obligation. Mark stood beside her with his phone in one hand, scrolling like he was managing a business deal. Susan was near the coffee station, stirring a paper cup she had not taken a sip from, her eyes moving over my dress, my shoes, my purse, measuring me the way people measure furniture they plan to replace. "There she is," Susan said, too brightly. "How are you holding up, honey?" She used honey the way other people used a napkin, something to cover a mess. I said, "I am here." Patricia glanced behind me as if expecting someone more useful to walk in. "Good. We have been talking, and we feel the white roses may be excessive." Jonathan was simple. I almost smiled at that. Jonathan had loved white roses. He had once pulled over on a 2-lane road in Vermont just to take a photograph of a white rose bush growing along a broken fence. Patricia did not know that because she had known the son she wanted more than the man he became. "The flowers stay," I said softly. Mark finally looked up. "Do we even know what all this costs?" Funerals can get out of hand fast. No offense, Emily, but this place is not exactly cheap. No offense always meant the offense had already been loaded and aimed. Mr. Collins appeared from the hallway with a folder in his hands. His eyes went straight to me first, respectful and steady. Mrs. Carter, would you like to step into the arrangement room? Patricia moved before I could answer. Yes, we all should. I am Jonathan's mother. Mr. Collins paused just long enough for me to notice. Then he opened the door and let us in. The room had a long mahogany table, soft lamps, and framed photographs of families who had once sat where we were sitting, trying to make love fit into paperwork. Patricia took the chair at the head of the table. Mark sat on her right. Susan took the left. They left one chair near the corner for me, beside a box of tissues and a small trash can. I sat there without comment. Mark tapped the folder. Let us see the invoice. The room went very still. Mr. Collins looked at me again, waiting for permission. I gave the smallest shake of my head. Not yet. He closed the folder gently and said, all financial arrangements are already in order. Patricia blinked. In order how? The service has been fully arranged, he said. There is no outstanding balance at this time. Susan turned toward me, surprised but not impressed. Did someone help you with that? The question was soft, but the insult inside it was not. I thought of the receipt in my purse. I thought of Jonathan's hand in mine. I thought of every night I had stayed awake counting his breaths while they counted what might be left behind. Jonathan deserved peace, I said. That was all. Patricia leaned back, dissatisfied because she could not find the weakness. She had come to press. Mark cleared his throat and began talking about the guest list, about who should speak, about how the Carter family had a certain reputation in town. Susan suggested that maybe I should let Patricia stand closest during the service because her mother's grief is different. I listened while they rearranged love into hierarchy. I listened while they spoke of Jonathan like a family heirloom they had misplaced and now wanted displayed properly. And with every sentence, I understood why my husband had underlined those words twice. The meeting should have ended after the guest list and the memorial program, but Patricia had saved the one thing she cared about most for last. She opened her black leather planner, slid out a folded seating chart, and placed it on the table like it was a legal document. I recognized it immediately because I had approved the original one with Mr. Collins that morning. My name had been in the front row, center aisle, beside the small table where Jonathan's photograph would sit. Patricia had been placed next to me. Mark and Susan were behind us with their spouses and children. It had been fair. It had been respectful. It had been what Jonathan would have expected. But the chart Patricia placed on the table was different. My name had been moved to the second row, far left, beside two cousins Jonathan had not seen in nearly a decade. Patricia's name was now front and center. Mark sat beside her. Susan sat beside Mark. The Carter family lined the entire first row like a fence. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Susan leaned forward and said, in that gentle voice people use when they are trying to make cruelty sound practical, "Emily, please understand. The front row is usually for immediate family." I looked at her. I am his wife. Mark shifted in his chair. Nobody is saying you are not, but blood family should sit closest. It is tradition. Tradition. That word had been used against me so many times I could almost hear Jonathan's tired sigh. It was tradition when Patricia insisted we spend every Thanksgiving at her house, even the year my father had surgery 2 days before the holiday. It was tradition when Mark made every family decision because he was the oldest son. It was tradition when Susan said wives came into a family but mothers built it. Now tradition had become a chair, and they were trying to take that too. Mr. Collins stood near the sideboard, his face composed but his eyes sharp. Mrs. Carter approved the original seating plan, he said. Patricia gave him a thin smile. Yes, and we appreciate Emily trying to help, but she is overwhelmed. We are simply making sure everything reflects Jonathan's family properly. I felt something in me go still. Not break. Not burn. Just go very still, the way a lake looks before a storm reaches it. I thought of Jonathan in our kitchen on Sunday mornings, barefoot, reading the paper while I made pancakes. I thought of him reaching for my hand in grocery store aisles for no reason at all. I thought of him telling me that marriage was not paperwork or a photograph or a ring, but the person who stayed when staying was hard. I had stayed. I had stayed through hospital nights, mortgage questions, insurance calls, medicine schedules, fear, exhaustion, and the quiet terror of waking up to check whether he was still breathing. Now his family, who had visited when convenient and cried when witnessed, wanted me to sit behind them at his funeral. Patricia tapped the paper with one manicured finger. "It will avoid confusion," she said. "People know where the Carter family belongs." I folded my hands in my lap so nobody could see how tightly my fingers pressed together. "And where do I belong, Patricia?" She blinked, surprised that I had asked the question out loud. Susan looked down into her untouched coffee. Mark pretended to check his phone. Patricia recovered quickly. "That is not what I meant." But it was exactly what she meant. It was what all of them meant. I looked at the seating chart again, at my name pushed back like an afterthought, and something inside me finally understood the shape of Jonathan's warning. They were not just trying to manage his funeral. They were trying to rewrite our marriage while his photograph sat in the next room. I turned to Mr. Collins and said quietly, "Use the seating chart Mrs. Carter brought." Patricia's face softened with victory because she thought I meant her. But Mr. Collins had heard the difference. He knew who had signed the contract. He knew who had paid the balance. He knew who Mrs. Carter truly was in that room. "Of course," he said. "I will make sure everything is prepared." Patricia gathered her planner, pleased with herself. Mark gave me a look that almost resembled pity. Susan touched my shoulder as she passed and whispered, "You are doing the right thing." I watched them leave the arrangement room together, confident, polished, and completely unaware that the truth was no longer buried. It was only waiting for the service to begin. On the morning of the service, I arrived at Collins & Sons before most of the guests, when the parking lot was still half empty and the sky over the white columns looked pale and cold. The chapel doors were open, and for a moment I stood in the back without moving, letting my eyes adjust to the soft gold light, the rows of wooden chairs, the white roses, and Jonathan's photograph at the front. Mr. Collins had chosen the picture I gave him, not the stiff one Patricia preferred from an old company banquet, but the one from Vermont where Jonathan was standing near a lake in a grey sweater, smiling like someone had just told him a secret worth keeping. I had taken that photo on our 15th anniversary. He had been laughing because I told him he looked too serious, and he said, "I am trying to look like a man who knows what he is doing." Now that same smile watched over a room full of people who thought they knew where they belonged in his life. Then I saw the front row. Patricia's coat was already draped over the center chair like a flag claiming land. Mark's folded program sat beside it. Susan's purse rested on the next seat. My name card was not there. Mine had been placed in the second row, far left, exactly where Patricia's version of the chart had put me. For a few seconds, I could not hear anything except my own breathing. It was such a small thing, a chair, a paper card, a few feet of space, but grief makes small things enormous. That seat was not about comfort. It was the last public place where I was supposed to sit beside my husband. It was the final room where people would understand, without needing an explanation, that I had been the woman who went home with him, prayed beside him, signed hospital forms, warmed soup at 2 in the morning, and learned how to smile at doctors when every answer sounded like a door closing. I walked slowly down the aisle and stopped beside Jonathan's photograph. His urn was not there because we had chosen a casket service, the simple oak one he had wanted, and it rested beneath a spray of white roses. I touched the edge of the flower arrangement, careful not to disturb it, and remembered the last winter of our marriage. Patricia had called once to say she could not visit because ice on the highway made driving dangerous, though she lived 20 minutes away and the roads had been salted since dawn. Mark had asked me whether Jonathan had updated his will before he asked how Jonathan was feeling. Susan had texted that she was emotionally exhausted and needed space from hospitals. I did not judge them then. I told myself everyone handles fear differently. But I knew the truth now. They had not been afraid of losing Jonathan. They had been afraid of losing access to the version of him that made them feel important. The sick man in the recliner, the husband who needed help standing, the brother who could no longer solve their problems or write checks or show up at family events looking successful, that Jonathan had been inconvenient to them. But he had never been inconvenient to me. He was my husband when he could carry grocery bags in both hands, and he was my husband when I had to cut his food into smaller pieces. He was my husband when he made me laugh in crowded restaurants, and he was my husband when his voice became too tired to finish a sentence. Love did not move backward because a body became weaker. Love moved closer. I looked at the empty space where my chair should have been and felt the ache rise behind my eyes, but I did not cry. Not there. Not for them. Mr. Collins approached quietly from the side aisle, holding a small black folder against his chest. Mrs. Carter, he said, low enough that only I could hear. I saw the seating change. I can correct it immediately. I looked at Patricia's coat in the center chair. I looked at my name in the second row. Then I looked at Jonathan's photograph, at that half smile that still knew me better than anyone in the room ever had. Leave it, I said. Mr. Collins frowned slightly. Are you certain? I nodded, though my throat felt tight. They want the closest seats. Let them have them. He studied my face, and I could see that he understood there was more inside my words than surrender. I reached into my purse and touched Jonathan's envelope, the paper already softened from how many times I had unfolded it. Do not let them make you smaller at my funeral. They had taken my chair, but they had not taken my place. They had pushed my name back one row, but they could not push 18 years of marriage out of the room. So I walked to the second row and sat where they had placed me, with my hands folded in my lap and the truth waiting quietly beside me. Guests began filling the chapel in small, careful waves, the way people enter a room where sorrow is already seated. They lowered their voices, touched my shoulder, whispered that Jonathan had been a good man, and then glanced toward the front row as if trying to understand why I was not sitting there. I saw the questions in their eyes, but I gave them a quiet nod and let them pass. Across the aisle, Patricia sat in the center chair with her back straight and a tissue folded perfectly in her hand. Mark stood near the front greeting people like a host at a fundraiser, shaking hands, accepting condolences, telling every second person how much there had been to manage. Susan moved from cluster to cluster with red eyes that looked freshly prepared, leaning into hugs just long enough for people to notice her grief. They were performing exactly the roles they had chosen, and for the first time since Jonathan died, I stopped trying to protect them from themselves. An older neighbor named Mrs. Whittaker came to me with tears in her eyes and took both my hands. She had lived 3 houses down from us for 12 years, and Jonathan used to clear snow from her driveway before going to work. Emily, she said softly, why are you back here? I looked toward Jonathan's photograph and smiled because the truth was too large to whisper in a chapel. It is where they put me. Her face changed, not with surprise, but with understanding. Before she could answer, Mark's voice carried from the front. We just wanted everything done properly, he was telling a man from Jonathan's old office. You know how these things are. Someone has to step up. The man nodded politely, but his eyes flicked toward me. Mark continued, encouraged by his own importance. Mom has been through enough, so I handled most of the difficult parts. Emily is grieving, of course, but she has never been good with responsibility under pressure. My hand stayed folded in my lap. I could feel Jonathan's envelope inside my purse against my knee, like a quiet weight keeping me anchored. Susan joined Mark near the aisle and lowered her voice, though not enough. After the service, we need to talk to her about the house. She cannot keep pretending life will stay the same. Mark sighed. I know. Jonathan always protected her from reality. Reality. The word almost made me laugh. Reality was the stack of medical bills I had organized at our kitchen table while everyone else sent thoughts and prayers. Reality was sleeping in a chair beside Jonathan because he rested better when he could hear me breathing. Reality was the funeral home receipt with my name on it and a zero balance printed in black ink. Patricia turned in her seat then, just enough to look at me over her shoulder. It was not a look of sorrow. It was a warning. She wanted me to remain small, quiet, grateful for whatever place they allowed me to occupy. I looked back at her without lowering my eyes. That was when Mr. Collins appeared at the side aisle, dressed in a dark suit, holding the black folder I had seen earlier. He did not interrupt. He only waited near the wall, respectful and calm. I opened my purse, took out my phone, and typed a message with fingers steadier than I expected. Please prepare the document. Then I looked at Jonathan's photograph, at that familiar Vermont smile, and pressed send. Within seconds, Mr. Collins glanced at his phone, then at me. I gave one small nod. His expression did not change, but he shifted the folder in his hands and walked toward the front desk beside the chapel entrance. Patricia did not notice. Mark was still talking. Susan was still arranging her grief where people could see it. The guests were still whispering. But something in the room had changed for me. I was no longer waiting for permission to belong. I was waiting for the moment when every lie they had dressed in black would have to stand in the light. The service began with the soft sound of piano music moving through the chapel, slow and familiar, the kind of hymn Jonathan used to hum under his breath when he thought nobody was listening. Everyone stood when Mr. Collins guided us into the formal beginning, and for one brief second, the room looked almost peaceful. Patricia lowered her head in the front row, Mark placed one hand over his heart, and Susan pressed a tissue beneath her eye. From the second row, I watched them carefully. I did not hate them in that moment. Hate would have required more energy than grief had left me. What I felt was clearer than hate. I felt the final layer of illusion slipping away. The pastor spoke first, a kind man from the Methodist church Jonathan and I sometimes attended on Easter and Christmas Eve. He talked about Jonathan's patience, his humor, his steady hands, the way he helped people without announcing it. When he mentioned the year Jonathan repaired the church pantry shelves on a Saturday morning and refused payment, several people nodded. I smiled because that was my husband. He never needed a stage to be decent. Then the pastor invited family members to speak, and Mark stood before anyone else could move. Patricia looked up at him with pride, as if he were carrying the Carter name to victory instead of walking 10 feet to a microphone. Mark unfolded a piece of paper and cleared his throat. My brother Jonathan was a man of responsibility, he began. He understood duty. He understood family. He understood that when difficult moments come, someone has to step forward and make sure things are handled properly. A few people nodded politely. I looked down at my hands. His words were not about Jonathan. They were about himself. These past days have been heavy for all of us, Mark continued, letting his voice tremble just enough to sound sincere. There were decisions to be made, arrangements to consider, expenses to face, and emotions to manage. Not everyone is built for that kind of pressure. The chapel became very still. I felt Mrs. Whittaker turn toward me. I did not move. Mark glanced in my direction for half a second, then looked back at the room. But that is what family does. Real family carries the weight when others cannot. Patricia closed her eyes, accepting the sentence like a blessing. Susan bowed her head, though I saw the corner of her mouth tighten with satisfaction. My face stayed calm, but inside my chest something cold and exact settled into place. There it was. The lie had finally stepped onto the microphone by itself. Mark spoke for several more minutes, praising Jonathan as a Carter man, a devoted son, a dependable brother. He mentioned their childhood fishing trips, their father's old pickup truck, summer barbecues, and family pride. He did not mention me once except indirectly, as an absence, a burden, a woman too fragile or too poor or too helpless to stand beside the man I had loved for 18 years. When he finished, he folded his paper and nodded to the room like someone expecting applause. The room gave him silence instead. It was not loud silence. It was worse. It was the kind of silence that listens. Mark stepped back from the microphone, and the pastor began to rise, but Mr. Collins moved first. He walked with quiet dignity from the side aisle to the front of the chapel, holding the black folder in both hands. Patricia turned her head sharply, confused. Mark looked annoyed, as if a staff member had interrupted his performance. Mr. Collins adjusted the microphone and looked out over the room. Before we continue with Mrs. Carter's selected memorial reading, he said, there is one formal acknowledgement that must be made according to the service record and the signed arrangement documents. Patricia's face changed at the words Mrs. Carter, because for the first time all morning, she was not sure which Mrs. Carter he meant. I slowly lifted my eyes from my hands. Mr. Collins opened the folder. His voice remained gentle, professional, and impossible to argue with. On behalf of Collins and Sons Funeral Home, we would like to recognize the person who arranged and paid for every part of today's service in full. Mark went pale before my name was even spoken. Mr. Collins looked down at the document, then lifted his eyes to the chapel with the calm of a man who had seen many families grieve, but not all of them tell the truth. Today's service, including the chapel, the floral arrangements, the memorial programs, the reception, the transportation assistance, and all related expenses, was arranged and paid for in full by Mrs. Emily Carter, beloved wife of Jonathan Carter. For 1 second, nobody moved. Not a cough, not a whisper, not the rustle of a program. It felt as if the whole room had forgotten how to breathe. Patricia's tissue froze halfway to her face. Susan's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Mark stood beside the front row with his folded speech still in his hand, his face drained of every confident color it had worn minutes earlier. I did not look away from Mr. Collins. I did not smile. I did not need to. The truth had walked into the room dressed better than revenge ever could. Then Mr. Collins continued, Mrs. Carter also requested that a short message from Jonathan be included if she felt the time was right. A murmur passed through the chapel. Patricia turned fully around then, her eyes finding me in the second row as if she had just realized I had been holding more than tissues in my purse. I reached inside, took out Jonathan's envelope, and stood. My knees felt weak, but my voice did not. Please play it, I said. Mr. Collins nodded to the young assistant near the sound table. The screen at the front, which had been showing Jonathan's photograph from Vermont, faded to black, then lit up again. Jonathan appeared seated in our living room, thinner than most people in that chapel remembered him, wearing his favorite grey cardigan with the loose button I never got around to fixing. His face was tired, but his eyes were unmistakably his, kind, aware, and a little amused, as if he knew this room might need one final lesson. If you are watching this, he began, then Emily decided I was right about something, which means she deserves extra credit because she usually lets me think I am right even when I am not. A few people gave soft, tearful laughs. I pressed the envelope against my chest. Jonathan looked directly into the camera. I asked Emily not to fight for a place in my family, because she already had the only place that mattered. She was my wife. She was my home. She was the person who stayed when staying was not easy. When I got sick, she did not love the healthy version of me and resent the rest. She loved all of me, even the parts one was ashamed to need help with. My vision blurred, but I kept standing. On the screen, Jonathan took a slow breath. To anyone who thinks money, blood, last names, or front row seats decide who mattered most in my life, I want you to understand something. Emily did not need to prove she belonged beside me. I belonged beside her? Patricia covered her mouth. Susan looked down at her lap. Mark stared at the floor like the carpet had become safer than the faces around him. Jonathan's voice softened. Em, if they make you feel small, remember this. You were the biggest blessing of my life. Do not let them move you backward, not in a chapel, not in a house, not in your own heart. The video ended on his tired smile, and the screen returned to the lake photograph. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything the Carter family could no longer deny. Mrs. Whittaker reached across the aisle and touched my hand. Someone behind me whispered, she paid for all of it. Another voice answered, after they made her sit back there. Patricia slowly turned away from me, her shoulders lower than before. Mark sank into his chair without meeting anyone's eyes. Susan pulled her purse off the front row seat beside her, as if the chair had suddenly become too expensive to occupy. I remained standing in the second row, Jonathan's letter in my hand, and for the first time since his death, I felt him beside me more clearly than anyone sitting in front could ever understand. When the video ended, nobody rushed to fill the silence, and that was when I understood how powerful quiet could be when the truth had already spoken. The pastor looked at me gently, as if asking without words whether I wanted to continue, and I nodded. I walked from the second row to the front of the chapel, past the seats they had taken, past Patricia's lowered face, past Mark's folded hands, past Susan's purse now clutched in her lap like something that could protect her from shame. Every step felt longer than the aisle actually was, but I did not feel small anymore. I placed Jonathan's envelope on top of the oak casket, just beneath the white roses, and rested my fingertips there for 1 second. Jonathan used to say that people reveal themselves most clearly when they think no one important is listening. I began. My voice sounded calm, even to me. I did not understand how true that was until this week. A few heads lowered. I did not look directly at the front row because this was not a performance for them. It was a final act of love for him. My husband was not perfect. He forgot birthdays until the last possible hour. He left coffee mugs in the garage. He believed duct tape could fix things that clearly needed a professional. But he was kind in ways that did not ask for applause. He shoveled neighbors' driveways before sunrise. He carried groceries for strangers. He remembered what people were afraid of and tried not to make those fears heavier. My throat tightened, but I kept going. In the last months of his life, Jonathan worried less about himself than about what would happen to the people he loved after he was gone. He worried about me most, not because he thought I was weak, but because he knew grief makes cruel voices sound louder than they deserve. Mrs. Whittaker wiped her eyes. Somewhere near the back, someone sniffled softly. I looked at Jonathan's photograph and smiled through the ache. So let me say this clearly. I did not pay for this service to prove I could. I paid for it because he was my husband, and love does not send. An invoice to the people watching from the front row. The words landed exactly where they needed to. Patricia covered her eyes. Mark stared at the floor. Susan's lips trembled, but I was finished carrying their embarrassment for them. Jonathan did not need a perfect family today. He needed honesty. He needed peace. And he deserved to be remembered by the life he lived, not by the seats people claimed after he was gone. I paused, then turned slightly toward the first row. You wanted the closest seats. I hope you finally understood what distance really means. No one answered. No one could. After the service, people came to me slowly, respectfully, not with pity, but with the kind of tenderness that does not need many words. Patricia approached near the reception room, her pearls uneven, her face pale. Emily, she whispered, I did not know. I looked at her for a long moment. No, Patricia. You did not ask. Mark tried to speak next, but the confidence had gone out of him. We thought. He began. I shook my head once. That was the problem. You thought too much and knew too little. Susan stepped back without saying anything. For the first time, silence did not belong to me. It belonged to them. I left Collins and Sons just before sunset, carrying Jonathan's letter, the receipt, and the house keys in my purse. The air outside was cold, but clean. I stood beside my car and looked back at the white columns, the place where they had tried to move me behind them and Jonathan had moved me back into the light. Then I drove home alone, not empty, not defeated, not broke in any way that mattered. The house would be quiet when I opened the door, and grief would still be waiting inside, but so would his coffee mug, his blue quilt, his photograph from Vermont, and the life we had built so deeply that no seating chart, no whisper, and no family name could ever erase it.